Good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Forum Speaker Webinar Series and Podcast. I'm Stacey Roman, and I will be moderating this discussion today. We're pleased to have Eytan Gilboa, Professor of International Communication at Bar-Ilan University, join us to discuss how is U.S. public opinion on Israel changing. Dr. Gilboa will speak for 15 minutes, then open it up for questions. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And with that, I will turn the discussion over to Dr. Eytan Gilboa. Oh, sorry, you're still muted. There we go.
Thank you very much. I will open with a few graphs about general trends in American public opinion toward Israel in the last 2 decades, from 2000 to 2020. We'll begin with a graph on this is the graph about views of Israel. You can see pretty stable results over the years. The upper line demonstrates favorable views of Israel. The bottom line in red represents unfavorable views of Israel. So you can see that in the last 20 years, from about 2/3 to 3/4 of Americans have expressed favorable views toward Israel. And you see some fluctuations over time, but we consider them to be quite stable. The second graph is about the distribution of sympathies in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Here you can see some changes at the beginning of the century when the Palestinians conducted the second intifada, the violent intifada against Israel. So the two sides received lower results. But overall, you can see, again, a lot of stability and so this is sympathies. This is sympathies vis-a-vis Israel and the Palestinians. Next slide shows this is support for the Palestinian state. Here we see some interesting change. This is again from 2000 to 2020. And you can see that here the results, the beginning of the Trump tenure at the White House, the results were pretty close. But as we move along the years, here we see much more support for the establishment of a Palestinian state. This is against. And the peak was here. This was, again, connected to the second intifada. And the reason for, I think the reason for this steep increase in support for the Palestinian state is the inclusion of this solution in official peace plans, processes, in American presidential statements. So when Trump issued his peace plan, it included the Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, over 70% of the West Bank. So this explains the change in the perception. I want to talk now about some differences between Democrats and Republicans. In this graph, the results are presented by 4 groups in American political map. We have conservative Republicans, moderate Republicans, then moderate Democrats and liberal Democrats. What is quite interesting is that overall, if you look just at the graph, there are differences, there are gaps. This is on the favorability issue that I presented to you at the beginning of my talk. So you can see here, this is conservative Republicans. This is the highest rate of favorability toward Israel. It's over 80%. And even liberal Democrats who are viewing Israel the least went up from 2000 to 2020, but still you see here some gaps between Republicans and Democrats over this particular issue of favorability toward Israel. Here, this issue is the sympathy, which I showed you earlier. And here you can see much more differences in the attitudes of Republicans versus Democrats. So, so the blue is Republican and red the Democrats. See, at the beginning here, 2000, 2001, the difference was was less. Here, as we move along through the 2 decades, we see major differences in sympathies, in the distribution of sympathies for Israel and the Palestinians between the Republicans and Democrats. So these are the Republicans, these are the Democrats. You can see here substantial differences. The next slide shows you differences between Republicans and Democrats over the issue of an independent Palestinian state. And so this is the Democratic graph. This is the Republican graph. And again, here you see a major gap in support for the establishment of a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza. The Democrats are supporting this solution much more than the Republicans. Incidentally, here the Republicans supported this solution more than the Democrats. But even here you can see, and this is, so you see here, increase in support for a Palestinian state. Here also you can see some increase. And again, I attributed this to the support both Obama and Trump exhibited for the establishment of a Palestinian state. Still, you see here a major gap. Here there is a summary of the differences between Republicans and Democrats in a major survey, a major 2020 survey. So you can see here, I have to go a little bit closer. So you can see here, that, again, we look at the same issues of favorability. So Republicans, 91% view Israel favorably compared to only 67% of Democrats. This is still high, but you see a major gap between Republicans and Democrats. Unfavorably, Republicans only 10%, the Democrats 33%. If we look at opinion of the Palestinian Authority, here we see only 9% viewed the Palestinian Authority favorably. 34% of the Republicans held the same view. 87% of Republicans held unfavorable view of the Palestinian Authority, but 64%, only 64% held the same view over the Palestinian Authority. About the sympathy issue, which I mentioned to you earlier, 86% of Republicans sympathize more with Israel. Only 44% of the Democrats sympathize more with Israel. Here, Republicans, only 5% sympathize more with the Palestinians, while 38% sympathize more with the Democrats. And finally, a Palestinian state, again, the issue we discussed earlier. So in 2020, just about a year ago, 44% of Republicans favored the establishment of Palestinian state. 70% of the Democrats held this view, and 48% of the Republicans opposed. Only 22% of the Democrats opposed the establishment of a Palestinian state. So you can see major gaps between the Republicans and Democrats over this is just Israel, and several key issues of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And so this is a clear demonstration of the gaps. And This here I have some differences between the Republicans and the Democrats over the Iran nuclear agreement. This is quite interesting. So in terms of support, only 3% of Republicans supported the agreement, 52% of the Democrats. Well, it is obvious due to the fact that Obama negotiated deal, and so this was clear. And then we see that only 8% of Republicans supported the deal, approved the deal. 41% of the Democrats. But what is interesting, 73% of the Republicans disapproved of the deal. Only 29% of the Democrats. But look at this. Look at this issue here. How much you trust that Iran will be complying with the deal? A lot. Only 2% of Republicans, but even Democrats only 11%. A little trust. 17% of Republicans, only 39% of Democrats, and not at all 80% Republicans, but 43% of the Democrats. And then who got more from the deal? The United States, Republicans only 8%, Democrats 15%. Iran, 67%, Republicans said, got more of the deal. 23% of the Democrats said Iran got more of the deal. So even the Democrats were a little bit, had little bit of reservations about the nuclear deal. Now, the differences between the Democrats and the Republicans can be attributed to two issues. One is the perception of Netanyahu as being closer to the Republicans, his intervention in presidential elections, and his close relations with Trump. In the eyes of Democrats, if you are close to Trump, then you are not viewed friendly by the Democrats. But the second issue is the tilt of the Democrats to the left. So the combination of internal development inside the Democratic Party, plus the close relations between Netanyahu and the Republicans, I think influenced and were responsible for the gaps. In terms of factors, what really influenced the distribution of opinions? Public opinion experts believe that presidents usually have significant influence on the distribution of opinions. My research does not show that. You could have seen earlier in the graphs that there haven't been much changes over time. So one would have expected the basic figures to decline during the Obama administration and perhaps to go higher during the Trump administration. I have not found that to be valid. The gap between left and right in the United States, as I have shown earlier, is a major factor. But as you could have seen, since there has been much increase in the Republican support for Israel, it offset it balanced the reduction in the Democratic support, and therefore the overall results remain pretty similar over time. Another factor is events that happen in Israel, the Middle East, in the United States. Usually violence and peace proposals, peacemaking have effect. Sometimes this is a short-lived effect. Sometimes it lasts longer. But I think one of the major factors in the shaping of the distribution of opinions in America is socio-demographics. And so I could say that the young support Israel much less than the old. If we break age by categories, we see that the oldest support Israel, the strongest, and the young, the weakest. We also see that non-whites, especially Hispanics and Afro-Americans, do not support Israel as much as the general public. I would say about the young that number one, they have very limited knowledge about what is happening in Israel and the Middle East. They depend on social media for information. And we know that the social media disseminates much false information and fabrication about what is happening here. And the young who go to college are exposed to left faculty and to the activities of the BDS movement. This should worry us because the young are going to be the leaders of the future. Hispanics are much less interested in Israel and the Middle East. They are interested much more, for obvious reasons, in Central and Latin America. It's very difficult to get to them. About Afro-Americans, I would say that here, the enemies of Israel in the United States have been trying to create an analogy between the blacks and the Palestinians and the whites and Israel. They also extensively use the apartheid claim and blame. And so Afro-Americans are influenced by these efforts, and they are the least supporters of Israel in public opinion polls. So in conclusion, I'm saying that the overall picture right now, the overall trends are good. The gaps between the Democrats and the Republicans are not so good because Israel needs bipartisan support in Congress. And I think that the major challenge is the young and the non-whites, and Israel and American Jewry have to find ways to reach these groups in the American society and try to help them and try to recruit them better to understand and support Israel. Much more information about my research can be found in an article that will come out in the Middle East Quarterly, which is published by the Middle East Forum in the next issue, June 2021. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. All right, so before we get started with the questions, our viewers would like to know, what is your data sources about how many people were sampled and what was the mode of data collection?
Oh, I have collected information from many public opinion polls conducted in the United States from 2000 to 2020. I used mostly reputable polling agencies. We know that there are all kinds of political organizations that commission polls. They are not interested in the results. They want to make a political statement. So I used the Gallup, Pew, university agencies, and I can rely better on their results. And the whole idea was to use as many polls as possible over time, because the more polls you use, the better and the better is, and the more accurate is the distribution over time.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Has there been any polls of independence regarding the same issue?
Can you repeat that, please?
Has there been a poll of the independent voters regarding the same issue?
Oh, yes, I have. When we have the distributions, I simply didn't include them in my presentation, but I would say yes. We have breakdowns for Republicans, Democrats, and independents. Independents on most of the questions, not over all of them. Independents are somewhere in between Republicans and Democrats. Sometimes they are closer to the Republicans, some other times they are closer to the Democrats. I would say that on the Iran nuclear deal, independents, for example, were closer to the Republicans. On Palestinian issues, independents are closer to the Democrats. So you cannot really say exactly where they are. It depends on the specific issue.
Wonderful. Were you able to look at regions or states to see which areas were pro or anti-Israel? I know you talked about the demographics a bit, but location as well.
This is a problem. I've written 4 books about American-Israeli relations, either just on the subject or I had chapters on public opinion in the books. And in one of the books, I was able to obtain regional distribution, but this has been beyond my research, my current research. But I think it would be safe to say that there would be the East Coast and the West Coast would be similar, and the rest and somewhat different from the rest of the United States, because we know the East is East and the West and the East. Many people think that the East or the West are the United States and ignore the Middle West and the rest of the United States. There are some differences. So I would say that in the Midwest and the South, there's more support, especially in the Bible Belt. There's much more support for Israel than in other regions. In the East and the West, it is less.
Thank you. How do you explain the growth and support of a Palestinian state under the Trump administration?
So as I've shown in the graph, I think this was one of the most interesting results coming out of my research, because first of all, I need to say that until Oslo, pollsters asked samples of American voters about the solutions to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, including the establishment of a Palestinian state. But after Oslo, somehow I have not seen this question coming up, not too frequently. And the reason for that is that most pollsters and newspapers thought that this is the only solution, that since Israel and the PLO breached the Oslo Agreement, so the establishment of a Palestinian state would be the only solution. When initially Trump said that he couldn't care less about the solution, he said in a famous statement, he said, 1 state, 2 states, as long as the Palestinians and Israelis agree on a solution, this would be fine with me. And at that time, the division in the public was very close, was 45 to 42%. But then the more the Trump administration talked about a solution that includes the establishment of a Palestinian state, going all the way to his peace plan, then the public responded by greatest support for that solution.
Thank you. The next question is, can you truly say that the trends are good when, other than Republicans, no other major groups support Israel to that extent?
Yes. So if you look at the demography, then I said earlier that the weakest support I found was among young and non-whites. So the opposite would be true. So we find stronger support for Israel, both at the bilateral level and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict among the old there. We find more support for Israel among those with higher education. We find gender didn't make much difference. We find religion is a factor. This is not surprising because of the evangelical strong support for Israel. And so we found some correlation between church attendance, which tells you about the level of religious commitments. So the more people go to church, the more they support Israel. So yes, these we found more support for Israel among these groups other than Republicans. Now, if you look at evangelicals, this is also interesting. Evangelicals who are Republicans are supporting Israel by, I don't know, 90%. By evangelicals who are Democrats support much less. So we see that gap between Republicans and Democrats also among the groups that are the most supportive of Israel.
Thank you. So we've had this question come in a few different ways, but what specific efforts can be made to reach the young and the non-white community?
The what? Efforts to do what?
To reach the younger population, and you said the non-white community is also usually less favorable.
Well, I think it's a major challenge, both for Israel and I think for American supporters of Israel. I lecture often in American universities. I'm spending sabbaticals, longer sabbaticals. 2019, I was at the University of Pennsylvania. I teach every year a summer course at the University of Southern California. The campus is a terrible place for the supporters of Israel and also for American Jews. There are many faculty, not only in Middle Eastern studies, which are badly controlled and are not really teaching. They are propagating about Israel and the Middle East, but even faculty in other areas. If you are now familiar with the Jerusalem Declaration about anti-Semitism, it came out from USC, the university I'm teaching in. They consulted with me and I told them that this would be a huge mistake. I have seen, I've been in several cases where supporters of the Palestinians or the BDS or people of the BDS tried to silence me. They claim a freedom of speech only for themselves, not for others. So intimidation, propaganda on campus, this is something that I think we need to approach donors to universities, because this is not just an Israeli issue. This has to do with the quality of American education, of what is happening on campus. We need to, first of all, we need to to document all of this. I've been writing a few pieces about it. So the campus is a major issue. I've been trying, I've established a nonprofit to do public diplomacy on behalf of Israel. And I've attempted to reach the Hispanics via chambers of commerce. We have done a few tours in the United States, and I thought this could be a good way to show them Israel's achievements, startup nation in technology, agriculture, medicine. And so we have to find, so this is what I've done myself for some time, and this was successful. I have no idea how to reach Afro-Americans. This has been, as I mentioned earlier, a very difficult task. But I think we have to find, first of all, we have to do much more. And secondly, we have to do much more effectively. In other words, to identify those areas, those weaknesses which we need to address, but also at the same time, exploit as much as we can the strength that we have, the assets that we have. The tendency is just to address weaknesses and ignore the strength and the advantages. And I think we need, this is a fight. This is like information warfare that both Israel and its supporters in the United States have to do together in order to defend and to attack those who are disseminating false information and trying to delegitimize and dehumanize Israel.
Thank you. And in our last minute here, can you talk about, were you able to look at the change in opinion for American Jews in the support of Israel?
Yes, I have a whole chapter of about American Jews. Again, there are general trends. Obviously, as we know, most American Jews vote for Democratic candidates, and at the presidential elections, also in other types of elections. Um, uh, there are certain areas where you don't see much changes from 2000 to 2020. I have attempted to examine a theory about American Jews in Israel, a theory that is called the distancing theory. This theory was invented by people who do not necessarily, American Jews, who do not necessarily like Israel. And the distancing theory says that that American Jews in general, especially the young, are distancing themselves from Israel. Israel is no longer important for them. It does not play a significant role in their practicing of Judaism. So there are certain issues that you do not find much changes. You see, when you talk about attachment to Israel, I have not found much differences between 2000 and 2020, but on specific issues, there are differences. And I think, again, I would attribute much of these differences to political beliefs. So American Jewish Democrats obviously have more reservations about Netanyahu and about Israel than, say, Republican Jews. And about 30% of American Jews are Orthodox, and they tend to identify more with Republicans, while those who are not affiliated or those who are affiliated with the Democrats obviously have more reservations.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And before we go, can you just remind our viewers where we can find some more of your work?
Yeah, so I've written a monograph published by the Begin Sadat Center for Strategic Studies at Bar Ilan, and also a few articles. There's one article just about Israel in Currents. This is a publication of the UCLA Center of Israel Studies, and a specific article about American attitudes toward the Israeli-Palestinian conflict would be available in the next issue of the Middle East Quarterly. And you can write to me, and I'll be happy to provide you with these publications if you're more interested in my work.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. We've come to the close of our webinar. Thank you again, Dr. Gilboa, for speaking with us today.
Thank you for
our
the
viewers
invitation thank you for the invitation to speak to your audience.
Of course. Of course. Sorry, we appreciate it. For our viewers and listeners, please join us Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern for an update from Ashley Perry. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a great day.